On May 28, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. What happened over the course of the next 60 years was one of the greatest tragedies in American history. The Trail of Tears was really the trails of tears. Multiple, hundreds of thousands of Native Americans from dozens of different tribes were forced to relocate to designated reservations between 1830 and 1890. The era was marked by wars, broken treaties, and deadly marches. This video is a long one, but we hope to see you till the end of it. We here at Nutty History are thankful for all of our fans. And now let's begin the story of why did the Native Americans have to relocate. The Declaration of Independence and the merciless savages. The Indian Removal Act didn't just pop out of thin air. It was a result of years of antagonism and mistrust between the European settlers and Native Americans. It's a dynamic that can be seen in one of the most important documents in American history, the Declaration of Independence. The language used in the Declaration of Independence gives us a glimpse into what a lot of the settlers and colonists thought of the Native Americans on the eve of independence from Great Britain. In the indictment section of the document, it states, "He, the King of Great Britain, has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and he has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." Go grab you a copy of the Declaration of Independence, and you can still find this bigoted sentence nestled among the elegant cursive drafted by Thomas Jefferson and penned by a guy named Timothy Matlack, whose handwriting adorns the Declaration. The statement reflected the settlers' perspective of Native Americans as a threatening and uncivilized force, a common stereotype in the 18th century. In the decades leading up to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, debates were raging over the rights of Native Americans and whether or not they should be kicked off their lands east of the Mississippi River. Those who were advocating for removal, including President Andrew Jackson, argued that it was in the best interest of the Native Americans to be relocated westward, where they could maintain their cultures without interference. It was a paternalistic, demeaning view that suggested that Native Americans were not capable of living in a civilized society, that they needed to be separated for their own good. It also conveniently supported the economic interests of Caucasian settlers, who were quite eager to expand their farms and plantations into the fertile lands that were so inconveniently occupied by people who lived there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. There were people who fought against the act, though. Tennessee Congressman and legendary frontiersman Davy Crockett wasn't happy about it. He saw the act as inhumane and unjust. Crockett argued that it was fundamentally wrong to remove Native Americans from their ancestral lands. Others, like New Jersey Senator Theodore Frelinghuysen, argued from a religious and moral standpoint. He said that the United States had a biblical duty to protect Native Americans and their rights. Their protest went unheard, though, and in 1830, both the House and the Senate passed the Indian Removal Act. Years of suffering were on the horizon. First up were the Choctaw. Choctaw removal. The Choctaw, who inhabited what's now Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, were one of the most populous tribes in the Southeast. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, signed in 1830, was the first removal treaty carried out under the Indian Removal Act. The Choctaw wound up ceding about 11 million acres of their traditional territory in exchange for around 15 million acres in the so-called Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. 11 million for 15 million might sound like a good deal, but the land they were moved to wasn't as fertile. And, well, it really wasn't their land, was it? The removal of the Choctaw started in 1831 and was carried out in 3 waves over the next 2 years. The conditions during the removal were deplorable. The Choctaw were forced to march over 500 miles during the cold winter months without adequate supplies. A blizzard during the first march was, well, a blizzard. Imagine having to walk 500 miles through a blizzard. Many became sick because of exposure to the elements and malnutrition, with an estimated 2,500 dying during the journey or shortly afterward. By the end of 1833, over 15,000 Choctaw were relocated. Whiskey treaties and the Potawatomi Trail of Death. Up north, the Algonquin-speaking Potawatomi Nation, which had land across Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois, including southern parts of the Great Lakes, was quickly losing most of it. The Potawatomi had allied with the British during the War of 1812 in the hopes that doing so would prevent more Americans from taking their land. But in the aftermath of their defeat, things got pretty bad, pretty fast. By 1818, the Potawatomi had already been part of more than a dozen treaties with the U.S. government. Between 1818 and 1828, they were part of 7 more. These 7 saw a lot of their land in Indiana ceded to the U.S. government. The Treaty of Tippecanoe in 1832 resulted in yet more lands lost, along with a stipulation that many of the Potawatomi had to move west of the Mississippi within 2 years. Now, 4 years later, things really started getting out of hand. In 1836 alone, the Potawatomi signed 9 treaties. The sheer number of treaties in a single year underscores the rapid pace at which the U.S. government was pushing its removal plan. One of the U.S. government's secret weapons in these treaties was whiskey. Many of the treaties signed by the Potawatomi and other nations were known as whiskey treaties. U.S. negotiators would often use the booze, which most Native Americans were not used to drinking, to get the Potawatomi leaders drunk and more liable to agree to bad deals that were quite often not in any way, shape, or form in the best interest of their people. I mean, think about it. Do you make good decisions if you've imbibed a bit too much? Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that you'd accidentally sold your house to a random person while out at the bar the night before. Not the best way to start your day. And hey, don't let me find out that any of you guys have done that before. The outcomes of these treaties were usually similar. The Potawatomi agreed to cede their lands in Indiana in exchange for smaller plots west of the Mississippi, often in present-day Kansas. These agreements were accompanied by promises of things like annual payments, goods, and sometimes outright bribes for individual leaders. And in a lot of cases, those promises were empty ones. Yet there was one Potawatomi chief who resisted. Chief Menominee, the leader of the Potawatomi at the Twin Lakes area in Indiana, was not budging in his belief that their ancestral lands were sacred and could not be sold or ceded. He believed that the land wasn't just an economic resource, but was deeply intertwined with the spiritual and cultural identity of the Potawatomi people. When the Treaty of the Yellow River was signed in 1836, one of that wave of 1836 whiskey treaties aimed at pushing the Potawatomi west of the Mississippi River, Chief Menominee and some of his followers said, "No thanks." They refused to recognize it because they had not been part of the negotiation process. In 1838, after the Potawatomi hadn't willingly relocated as the Treaty of the Yellow River stipulated, the newly formed state of Indiana decided to take action. A U.S. general named John Tipton was ordered to mobilize a militia and evict Menominee and his people. In September of that year, Tipton and his militia surrounded Chief Menominee's village at Twin Lakes. The Potawatomi were given almost no time to gather any of their belongings. On September 4th, 859 members of the tribe were forced to march west across the Mississippi to Kansas. The journey was over 660 miles and took more than 2 months. The conditions during the march were horrible. The Potawatomi were not prepared for the journey because they'd been removed from their homes so abruptly. They faced disease, inadequate food and supplies, and a harsh winter. It's estimated that over 40 people, mostly young and the elderly, lost their lives during the march because of these conditions. The Long Walk of the Navajo. A few years after the wars and relocations in the Northwest, the Navajo in the Southwest went through their own series of betrayals, battles, and relocations. Tensions? Well, they really picked up after the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, and the U.S. acquired vast territories in the Southwest through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which included traditional Navajo lands. In 1849, the Navajo and the U.S. signed their first official treaty, which was basically a peace treaty. They had signed a treaty a few years earlier called the Treaty of Bear Springs, but it was never ratified by the U.S. Senate. Despite being a peace treaty, the 1849 agreement also included the construction of a U.S. fort, Fort Defiance, on Navajo land and incentives for the Navajo to take up more sedentary lifestyles in the form of the U.S. government giving them sheep and other livestock. The treaty ultimately failed to address a lot of underlying issues and didn't consider the complexities of Navajo relations with other tribes, especially the Utes. There were ambiguities surrounding territorial boundaries and eventual encroachments onto Navajo lands that made a lot of the Navajo pretty unhappy, and by the early 1860s, things turned violent. One of the least happy Navajo was a guy named Manuelito. This towering 6-foot-tall warrior had cut his teeth in battles against Mexico, as well as other rival nations like the Utes and the Pueblo. By the early 1860s, he set his sights on the U.S. and its continued encroachment onto Navajo land. Manuelito led raid after raid against U.S. settlers and eventually engaged the U.S. military. On August 30th, 1860, Manuelito led an army of 1,000 Navajo warriors towards the gates of Fort Defiance, the fort that had been established after the 1849 treaty. Manuelito and his men nearly took the fort, but the U.S. defenses held and the Navajo were forced to retreat. This obviously increased tensions a whole lot, but despite this, an uneasy truce was signed on February 15, 1861. But the truce was a bad one that Manuelito wouldn't even sign. The U.S. government was trying to kind of unofficially push the Navajo into specific boundaries, and as part of the truce, the Navajo had to cede a lot of their traditional lands, including territories that held spiritual significance. 2 of the Navajo's 4 sacred mountains were taken. These mountains are integral to Navajo spirituality and cosmology. They represented, and still represent, the cardinal directions and the boundaries of the traditional Navajo homeland. Losing access to these sacred sites was both a territorial loss and a deep spiritual and cultural blow. Then, in 1863, Kit Carson came around. Carson is often remembered as a rugged frontier hero, but his role in the subjugation and forced relocation of the Navajo people cast him in a much darker light. In the midst of the Civil War, Carson was ordered to carry out a scorched earth campaign against the Navajo. He and his men went around burning crops, razing entire villages, and taking out all the livestock that the Navajo had quickly come to rely on after the U.S. government gifted them so many in their attempt to make the nation more sedentary. In the winter of 1864, Carson's army laid siege to one of the last Navajo pockets of resistance in Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. They burned more Navajo crops, destroyed their homes, killed over 200 sheep, and took the lives of 23 resistance fighters before the Navajo finally surrendered. After the siege and the ultimate collapse of the Navajo resistance, they were taken to Fort Defiance and then marched over 300 miles to a reservations area called the Bosque Redondo at Fort Sumner in New Mexico. Between 1863 and 1866, over 10,000 Navajo made the long walk, trekking through tough desert conditions that resulted in the demise of 200 people. If they made it to the camp, things didn't get any better. Life at Bosque Redondo was difficult and bleak. The land wasn't fertile, making farming challenging. Without much of anything to eat, the U.S. government gave them meager supplies of canned goods as well as flour, lard, and sugar. They used these ingredients to make what's become known as Navajo fry bread, a traditional staple that evolved out of necessity in those dark times. The Navajo were also confined alongside their traditional enemies, the Mescalero Apache, which inevitably led to violent altercations, Tacon disease, and the fact that the camp was terribly overcrowded. And the result was that 2,000 more Navajo lost their lives during their imprisonment at the camp. After years of suffering, the U.S. government recognized that the Bosque Redondo experiment was a complete bust. On June 1, 1868, in a rare instance of partial sympathy, the Treaty of Bosque Redondo was signed, which allowed the Navajo to return to a portion of their ancestral homeland. This established the Navajo Reservation. The Navajo referred to their journey back as the Beautiful Walk. They were able to return to a homeland that had been devastated, but over time, they rebuilt their communities and herds, and the Navajo Nation grew to become the largest federally recognized tribe in the United States. The First Seminole War. Like many Native American tribes in the 1800s, the Seminole tribe of Florida was systematically forced off their land. But unlike many others, a small group of them remain the only Native Americans to never have signed a peace treaty with the U.S. government. Their story is one of perseverance and tragedy. 3 wars over the span of 40 years between 1816 and 1858 were the most deadly and expensive wars for the U.S. government in the entire 300-year series of American Indian Wars. One of the main characters in the First Seminole War was none other than Andrew Jackson. Decades before signing the Indian Removal Act as the 7th President of the United States, Jackson made a name for himself as a major general fighting the Native Americans, the Spanish, and the British, and doing so pretty ruthlessly. In 1816, there were ongoing border disputes between the United States and Spanish Florida. As the name suggests, Florida was still technically controlled by Spain, but Spain was pretty preoccupied by a guy named Napoleon who was trying to become the Emperor of Europe, so they were kind of like absentee landlords. Despite Spain's claim to Florida, Jackson was ordered by then-President James Madison to snuff out some Seminole and Creek raids on American territory, raids that were originating in Spanish Florida. One of the early events of the war was the destruction of the Negro Fort on the Apalachicola River, a stronghold for escaped slaves and rebellious Seminole Indians, and a base from which Seminole and African Americans would launch their raids into U.S. territory. The base had actually been built by the British during the War of 1812 in the hopes that they could conquer some of the Southeast. Again, Spain was preoccupied with Napoleon, and the British were able to take advantage of that in Florida. Now, the British didn't stay long, though, and in 1815, the fort fell into the hands of Seminole and escaped or freed slaves. Southern plantation owners, well, they didn't like that at all. They figured it could lead to an uprising that would ruin their very lucrative business of free labor and trafficking in human suffering. So, General Jackson ordered that the fort be demolished, and it essentially was. U.S. naval ships sailed down the river to the fort and bombarded it with artillery. The fort's defenses, though formidable, were not ready for such heavy-duty artillery. A heated shot from a gunboat hit the fort's gunpowder stockpile, causing a massive explosion that killed over 250 of the fort's 300 defenders. It was one of the largest single explosions in the Western Hemisphere. Then Jackson went rogue. In 1818, following a series of attacks and counterattacks between American settlers and Seminole Indians, Jackson was tasked with putting an end to the raids once and for all. But instead of conducting a limited military operation like he was asked, Jackson seized the opportunity to invade Spanish Florida in its entirety, capturing multiple Spanish forts including St. Mark's in Pensacola. He also killed 2 British subjects, Robert Ambrister and Alexander Arbuthnot, who were accused of aiding the Seminole, actions that nearly sparked an international incident. Jackson's invasion of Florida made it pretty clear to Spain that it would have a hard time maintaining control of the territory, and in 1819, they signed the Adams-Onis Treaty, which ceded all of Florida to the U.S. in exchange for $5 million. Jackson's invasion also established him as a hardcore enforcer against Native American resistance and a champion of American expansionism. In the aftermath of the First Seminole War, no Native Americans were forced from their land. After all, the U.S. had just acquired the land from the Spanish. They'd barely had time to start kicking the tribes off their ancestral homes. Second Seminole War and removal. That would happen in the Second and Third Seminole Wars. By the end of them, over 4,000 Seminoles were forced westward into Indian Territory in Oklahoma. The Second Seminole War was by far the larger of the two. It was sparked over U.S. efforts to enforce the so-called Treaty of Payne's Landing, which a few Seminole chiefs signed in 1832, agreeing in theory to relocate westward. A lot of Seminoles, including an influential warrior and leader named Osceola, rejected the treaty and resisted removal. According to one legend, Osceola saw the treaty on a table and slammed it with his knife in disgust. It soon became clear that many of the Seminole weren't going to give up their lands, and in 1835, the U.S. government decided to march armies into the territory and take it by force. The war was prolonged, costly, and brutal, and it became one of the most significant Indian wars in U.S. history. By the end of the war in 1842, 7 years after it started, the U.S. had spent more than $20 million and had relocated about 3,000 Seminoles. Many of these Seminoles were sent to Indian Territory in the West. But the Seminoles refused to give up. They were perhaps the most successful Native American tribe when it came to resisting the U.S., and a small group of 400 to 500 Seminole, led by a guy named Sam Jones, never signed a treaty. They were the only Native Americans to never sign a peace treaty and technically are still at war with the U.S. Their ancestors live on the outskirts of the Everglades to this day. Sam Jones, also known by his Seminole name Abiaka, was a medicine man and a warrior who belonged to the Miccosukee tribe, a part of the Seminole Nation. He was a bit older than some of the other Seminole leaders at the time, like Osceola, and was highly respected among the nation for his wisdom and spiritual authority. Abiaka's resistance to U.S. expansion was impressive. His opposition was so steadfast that when several Seminole leaders, including Osceola, were tricked into capture under a flag of truce, Abiaka was notably absent. He'd refused to attend the meeting with U.S. authorities. Abiaka was a master of guerrilla warfare and used his knowledge of the Florida terrain to lead effective resistance against the better-equipped U.S. Army. His fighters would strike quickly and then disappear into the Everglades, frustrating U.S. attempts to engage the Seminole in traditional open warfare. After Osceola was captured as part of that aforementioned dirty trick played by the U.S., he died in prison. Abiaka assumed a more visible leadership role in the resistance. Now, under his guidance, the Seminole continued to put up quite a fight, which led to more costly and drawn-out campaigns for the U.S. military. Despite multiple attempts by U.S. forces to capture him and subdue the Seminole, Abiaka managed to avoid capture. Even after the end of the Second Seminole War in 1842, he and a small group of Seminole remained in the Everglades, free from U.S. control. Apiaka's refusal to surrender or negotiate with the U.S. government solidified his status as a symbol of Seminole resistance and resilience. His legacy lives on among the Seminole and Miccosukee tribes in Florida today. Creek removal. Obviously, other tribes weren't able to resist like the Seminole, and for various reasons. Internal conflict, corrupt chiefs, the pressure of a government with a vastly superior army, fake promises that amounted to dangling of rotten carrots on strings. All these factors contributed to many tribes losing all of their land. All of it. In the decade after the signing of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the Creek Nation, also known as Muskogee, which had territory spanning what's now Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia, and southern Florida, became one of those tribes. It'll help to go back in time, before the Indian Removal Act, to understand exactly what happened to the Creek. Between 1790 and 1830, the Creek Nation signed 10 treaties with the U.S. government, a lot of which slowly but surely chipped away at Creek territory. By 1812, the Creek Nation was divided between the Upper Creek, also known as the Red Sticks, and the Lower Creek. The Lower Creek, under the leadership of Chief William McIntosh, were quickly becoming allies of the U.S. government. They had trade relations. McIntosh himself was half Caucasian, the son of a Scottish-American soldier and a Creek mother. His Creek name was actually Tustanugee Hutke, which translates to Caucasian warrior. The Creek were a matrilineal society, so McIntosh was considered a legitimate chief. Tensions between the Upper and Lower Creek over westernization versus maintaining a traditional way of life boiled over into civil war, which ended up being part of the larger War of 1812. In 1813, Chief McIntosh and the Lower Creek sided with Andrew Jackson and the U.S. government and fought the Red Sticks to the north, who were allied with the British. Even back then, satellite wars were a thing. The violence lasted for a year between July 1813 and August of 1814. The U.S. and their Lower Creek allies were victorious, and Chief McIntosh was probably expecting some kind of reward or thank you from Jackson and the U.S. in return for his loyalty. But nah, man. Jackson didn't draw any distinction between the Upper and Lower Creek, and after the war, the 1814 Treaty of Fort Jackson resulted in more than 21 million acres of Creek land, Upper and Lower Creek land, being ceded to the U.S. McIntosh led initiatives to unite the Upper and Lower Creek into a centralized government that took a lot of inspiration from Western traditions. Despite his hand in the loss of all that land, he also helped institute laws that protected the remaining tribal lands. He also helped set up a Creek Nation police force called the Lawmenders to help enforce the laws. But despite the laws and the law enforcement, McIntosh gave in to U.S. pressure and ceded yet more land to the U.S. in 1921, which angered a lot of other Creek leaders. Chief McIntosh's downfall came in 1825, when he and 8 other chiefs signed the Treaty of Indian Springs, despite opposition from a lot of other Creek leaders. The treaty ceded the remainder of the Creek territory in Georgia and a big chunk in Alabama. In total, another 4 million acres of land were lost to the U.S. government. In return, the U.S. promised to pay the Creek Nation $200,000 annually, equivalent today to around $5.5 million, and give McIntosh himself a nice little lump sum payment of $200,000. McIntosh's longtime rival, a Red Stick named Chief Menowa, led a force of 150 law members, a force that, remember, McIntosh helped create and stormed McIntosh's plantation. And yeah, he had made a bunch of money by this point and was living on a nice estate. The Creek then burned down his house and ended McIntosh's life. The Creek War. 5 years later, after McIntosh's death, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. 2 years after that, the Creek Nation and the U.S. government signed the Treaty of Cusseta. The treaty divided up the Creek lands in Alabama among individual Creek families. Each family got a specific piece of land with the option to either sell it or remain on it as private citizens of the state of Alabama. If a family chose to sell, the U.S. government would help facilitate the sale and offer protection against fraud. The treaty promised the Creek protection from fraud and coercion in land sales, in theory. While the treaty technically allotted individual land parcels to Creek families with the understanding that they might sell these to non-native settlers, it also set the stage for widespread dispossession. Many Creek were cheated out of their lands or faced increasing pressures from encroaching settlers. By the mid-1830s, tensions had escalated even further, leading to the Creek War of 1836. The U.S. government swooped in and quickly suppressed the war. The Creek was marched across hundreds of miles with little food, shelter, or medical care. Many were transported in filthy conditions on boats. It's estimated that up to 3,500 Creek, out of the 15,000 who were forcibly relocated, lost their lives during the removal process. By the 1840s, the Creek Nation had been effectively dispossessed of all its traditional lands in the southeastern U.S. Boarding schools and forced assimilation. One of the final forced mass relocations of a Native American nation came in 1880, when the Ute Removal Act forced the Utes from what remained of their ancestral lands and marched them to a reservation in Utah. But the end of these forced relocations was only the beginning. In a lot of ways, an even more insidious relocation effort commenced and would continue until well into the 1970s, the forced cultural assimilation of Native Americans into Western culture. This relocation came in the form of boarding schools. The main goal of these institutions was cultural assimilation. Indigenous culture, language, dress, and belief systems were systematically suppressed in favor of Western European American customs and beliefs. The boarding school system for Native Americans was inspired by the model established at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, which operated from 1879 to 1918. It was founded by an Army captain named Richard H. Pratt. Over time, the Carlisle model was replicated across the country. By the late 19th century, the federal government had funded 25 off-reservation boarding schools, and by 1925, there were over 100. In time, more schools were built on the reservations themselves instead of basically busing students outside of them. When the children arrived at the schools, they had their traditional clothing confiscated and were dressed in military-style uniforms. Their long hair, which often had cultural and spiritual significance, was cut. Students were forbidden to speak their native languages, even amongst themselves. These kids were often forcibly removed from their homes and communities, resulting in families being torn apart. Parents frequently had little or no contact with their children for extended periods, and siblings could be separated as well. The fact that these students were forced off the reservations that their families had been forced onto only a few years prior is another twisted irony, and was most likely another factor in making sure these Native American kids were removed as far as possible from their cultural heritage. The last of these federally operated boarding schools closed in the 1970s. The 1970s. Think about that. The legacy of Native American relocation is a tragic one. It was more far-reaching than what students are taught in school about the Trail of Tears. It was a systematic, century-long process of mass incarceration and displacement across the country. Yakima War and Northwest relocations. As the American frontier expanded ever westward, leaders of more and more Native American nations were asked to sign the dotted lines of treaties that offered up empty promises and inevitably stripped them of their land. In the Northwest, the Washington Territory was officially declared a U.S. territory in 1853, and thus all the tribes living there were asked to leave or to move on to nearby reservations. It sparked the Yakima War and yet more forced relocations. Washington Territory was vast. It spanned all of present-day Washington State, Oregon, and Idaho, as well as parts of Wyoming and Montana. As you'd expect, there were a lot of Native Americans already living on the land, more than 24 major tribes. One of them, the most relevant to this story anyway, was the Yakima. Shortly after the U.S. established the Washington Territory, they entered into a series of negotiations with the Yakima and neighboring tribes that led to yet another treaty. The treaty with the Yakima was signed in 1855 between representatives of the U.S. government, led by the newly appointed governor of the territory, Isaac Stevens, and leaders of the Yakima Nation and 13 other tribes and bands across the territory. The treaty required the tribes to cede over 11 million acres of their ancestral lands to the U.S. One of the most influential Yakima chiefs, Kamiakin, took a long time to convince, but he eventually would sign the document with a simple X, the typical signature of Native American chiefs who often couldn't read any of what was written in these treaties. In exchange for the ceded lands, the U.S. government established the Yakima Reservation, a 1.5 million acre plot of land where the tribes were expected to live permanently. 11 million acres in exchange for 1.5 million acres. That math ain't mathin', is it? The treaty stipulated that the tribes kept their right to fish, hunt, and gather traditional food and medicine in all their usual places outside the reservation. Some tribal leaders claimed they were deceived or that they misunderstood the treaty's terms. They had a point. If you couldn't read any of the print, let alone the fine print, then it's kind of difficult to have any real understanding of what you're agreeing to. Caucasian settlers were flooded into the territory in the hopes of hitting the oil or gold jackpot exacerbated things further. These were peak gold rush times, and the influx of people led to increased aggression and tensions. The death of a few Caucasian prospectors at the hands of the Yakima and the death of a few Yakima at the hands of Caucasian settlers were the straws that broke the camel's back and helped kick off the Yakima War, which lasted from 1855 to 1858. The coalition of northwestern tribes, which included the Yakima, Walla Walla, and 6 others, was able to put up a pretty good fight against the U.S. forces. At first, led by the aforementioned Chief Comican, they won a decisive victory in the first battle of the war, the Battle of Toppenish Creek, and another semi-victory in the Battle of Union Gap, where they held their own despite being outnumbered 2-1. But things would soon take a wrong turn for Comican, Yakima, and his allies. The U.S. quickly built a series of forts and roads, and by 1856, they were able to transport more troops and supplies in less time. The U.S. also capitalized on the divisions of the Native American tribes, just like they had with the other nations like the Creek. While tribes like the Yakima and their allies were united in resisting U.S. advances, not all tribes or factions within tribes agreed about strategies of resistance. The U.S. military and government agents were able to win over those holdouts with things like bribes and promises of protection, money, and protection that in many cases never came. This helped them divide and conquer, classic military strategy that was used by the U.S. throughout the 300-year-long American Indian Wars. At the same time the Yakima War was playing out in the east of the territory, another one popped up farther west, and for almost the exact same reasons. The Puget Sound War was fought from 1855 to 1856 over an unfair treaty between the U.S. and 9 other tribes, including the Nisqually and the Puyallup. These tribes were pretty ticked off that they were promised access to their traditional fishing and hunting lands, but were then pushed to places that were too rocky to farm, didn't have access to salmon, and were just all around inferior plots. The aftermath of the Yakima and Puget Sound Wars led to the loss of around 90% of the Pacific Northwest tribes' ancestral lands. These tribes didn't go through some of the terrible en masse forced marches like other Native American nations to the east, but they were funneled into smaller pieces of land that they basically couldn't leave. They needed permission to travel outside of them, and as the gold rush continued and Caucasian settlers hit it big, the people whose land they took languished in what basically amounted to geographic prisons. Thanks for watching. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, we want to say thank you so much for this long ride. And know this, we love all our supporters and fans. What else would you like to learn about Native Americans? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more Nutty History.